The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the hospital's glass doors as Elizabeth Anderson stood motionless, her world crumbling around her. Water dripped from her dark hair, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the crumpled paper in her trembling hands, a medical bill that might as well have been a death sentence. At 28 years old, Elizabeth had always thought she was doing everything right. She'd worked hard through college, earned her teaching degree, and landed a job at Lincoln Elementary School teaching 3rd grade. Her students adored her, their faces lighting up each morning when she walked into the classroom. But life had other plans. The first blow came 3 months ago. Budget cuts forced the school to lay off their newest teachers, and Elizabeth, being one of the last hired, was among the first to go. She tried to stay positive, telling herself it was just a temporary setback. She had some savings, after all, and she could find another teaching position. Then her mother started getting headaches. Not normal headaches, the kind that made her clutch her head and cry out in pain. Elizabeth had insisted on taking her to the doctor, using what remained of her savings to pay for the initial visits. The diagnosis hit like a thunderbolt. Stage 4 brain cancer. Now, standing in the hospital entrance, Elizabeth stared at the impossible number on the bill, $200,000. The amount seemed to grow larger every time she looked at it, mocking her empty bank account and crushed dreams. Her mother needed surgery, chemotherapy, and specialized care, none of which they could afford. A young nurse walked past, giving Elizabeth a concerned glance. "Are you all right, miss? You're soaking wet." Elizabeth barely heard her, lost in memories of her mother's strength through the years. Maria Anderson had raised Elizabeth alone after her father abandoned them when Elizabeth was just 4. She'd worked 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night, to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Even on her most exhausted days, Maria had always found the energy to help Elizabeth with her homework, to attend every school play, to make each birthday special with homemade cakes and hand-sewn dresses. Now it was Elizabeth's turn to take care of her mother, and she was failing miserably. She'd already applied to 37 teaching positions, but schools weren't hiring mid-year. She tried waitressing, but the tips barely covered gas money. She'd even sold her car, moving into a tiny studio apartment so she could use the money for her mother's initial treatments. The medical bill trembled in her hands as another wave of despair washed over her. Behind those hospital doors, her mother lay in a narrow bed, trying to put on a brave face despite the constant pain. Maria had insisted she didn't want Elizabeth to worry about the costs, that they would figure something out. But Elizabeth had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, the same fear that now threatened to drown her. A crack of thunder made Elizabeth jump, bringing her back to the present moment. She folded the bill carefully, tucking it into her wet jacket pocket. Her shoes squeaked against the hospital floor as she walked to the elevator, pressing the button for the oncology ward. Room 412 had become painfully familiar over the past weeks. The mint-green walls, the steady beep of monitors, the ever-present smell of disinfectant. Elizabeth paused in the doorway, watching her mother sleep. Maria's face was pale against the white hospital pillows, her once thick black hair now thin and brittle from the preliminary treatments. "Mom," Elizabeth whispered, not wanting to wake her if she was truly resting. Maria's eyes fluttered open, and despite everything, she smiled. That smile, the one that had gotten Elizabeth through every scraped knee, every failed test, every heartbreak, now broke Elizabeth's heart into pieces. "There's my girl," Maria said softly, patting the bed beside her. "You're all wet, sweetheart. Did you forget your umbrella again?" Elizabeth sat carefully on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's frail hand in hers. "The umbrella's not the problem, Mom." She tried to keep her voice steady, to be strong like her mother had always been. "I know, baby." Maria squeezed her hand. "But we'll figure it out. We always do." Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. How could she tell her mother that they'd run out of options, that their health insurance had denied the claim, that no bank would give them a loan, that even if she worked every hour of every day, she couldn't earn enough fast enough. Outside the window, lightning flashed across the darkening sky. Elizabeth watched the raindrops race down the glass, each one carrying a fragment of her hope with it. She needed a miracle, but miracles seemed in short supply these days. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Thompson stood there, his face grave as he clutched a folder. "Miss Anderson, could I speak with you for a moment?" Elizabeth kissed her mother's forehead before following the doctor into the hallway. Her heart pounded with each step, knowing that whatever news he had couldn't be good. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dr. Thompson cleared his throat. "We need to discuss your mother's treatment plan," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "Without immediate intervention, her condition will deteriorate rapidly. The tumor is growing faster than we anticipated." Elizabeth wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together. "How long?" she managed to ask. "Without treatment, maybe 2 months. With proper care, we could extend that significantly, possibly even." He trailed off, knowing from her expression that the cost made such possibilities irrelevant. Elizabeth leaned against the wall, letting it support her weight as her legs threatened to give out. 2 months, 8 weeks, 60 days. How could a lifetime of love and sacrifice be reduced to such a cruel countdown? As she stood there, watching doctors and nurses hurry past, Elizabeth made a silent promise to her mother and to herself. She would find a way. She had to. Even if it meant working herself to exhaustion, even if it meant selling everything she owned, even if it meant begging on street corners, she would not let her mother's story end this way. Thunder rumbled again, closer now, as if the sky itself shared her determination. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, wiped her eyes, and walked back into her mother's room, managing a smile she didn't feel. She might be broken, but she wasn't beaten. Not yet. Not while her mother still needed her. Elizabeth shivered in her car, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders as dawn broke over the city. The old Honda Civic had become her home for the past 3 weeks, parked in different spots each night to avoid attention. The passenger seat was reclined to make a bed, while the back seat held the few possessions she couldn't bear to sell: photo albums, her teaching degree, and her mother's favorite sweater. Her phone alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. Elizabeth quickly changed in the cramped space, using the rearview mirror to make herself presentable for her first job of the day. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion, but she covered them carefully with concealer. No one at any of her jobs knew she was homeless. By 6 a.m., she was brewing coffee at Pete's Diner, forcing a smile as the morning regulars trickled in. From 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., she waited tables, then rushed across town to work as a receptionist at a dental office until 6 p.m. Her nights were spent stocking shelves at a grocery store until midnight. Every spare moment between shifts was dedicated to visiting her mother in the hospital. Despite working nearly 20 hours a day, she had only managed to save a fraction of what they needed. The hospital bills continued to grow, and her mother's condition worsened with each passing day. Elizabeth stored her tips in an envelope tucked under the car's floor mat, counting them obsessively each night. The total was never enough. It was during her afternoon shift at the dental office when Robert Miller first walked in. He carried himself with the confidence of wealth, his tailored suit and expensive watch marking him as different from their usual patients. Elizabeth noticed him watching her as she efficiently handled phone calls, paperwork, and patient inquiries. "You're quite good at multitasking," he commented after his appointment, lingering at her desk. "Where did you learn such organizational skills?" "I was a teacher," Elizabeth replied, trying to keep her voice professional despite her exhaustion. "3rd grade." "Was?" His eyebrows raised slightly. Before she could stop herself, Elizabeth found herself telling him about the layoffs. Perhaps it was fatigue wearing down her usual reserve, or maybe it was the genuine interest in his expression, something she hadn't encountered in weeks. "That's quite unfortunate," he said, pulling out a business card. "I'm actually looking for a personal assistant. Someone with your skills would be perfect." Elizabeth studied the card. Robert Miller, CEO of Miller Enterprises. The company name meant nothing to her, but the downtown address spoke of success. The salary would be substantial, he added, naming a figure that made her heart stop. It was more money than she'd make in 3 years of teaching. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she held the card. That's very generous, but it seems too good to be true. Robert smiled, but something in his eyes made her uneasy. I reward competence well, Ms. Anderson. Think about it. Call me if you're interested. She tucked the card into her pocket, trying to ignore how it seemed to burn there throughout her evening shift. After midnight, sitting in her car and counting the day's tips, she pulled it out again. The next morning, Elizabeth visited her mother before her first shift. Maria was having a bad day, the pain medications barely taking the edge off her suffering. The sight of her mother's face, drawn with pain, made Elizabeth's decision for her. She called the number during her lunch break. Robert's secretary immediately put her through. I had a feeling you'd call, he said, his voice smooth. Can you start Monday? The speed of it all made Elizabeth's instincts scream mornings. No formal interview, no background check, just an astronomical salary offered to a stranger. But when she opened her mouth to ask questions, all she could think of was her mother's medical bills. Yes, she heard herself say. I can start Monday. The weekend passed in a blur as Elizabeth quit her other jobs and used her last money to buy a suitable outfit from a thrift store. Monday morning found her standing in front of Miller Enterprises' gleaming office tower, her heart pounding. Robert met her in the lobby, looking even more polished than before. Welcome aboard, he said, leading her to an elevator that required a special key. Your discretion will be essential in this position. Everything you see or hear stays absolutely confidential. The elevator opened directly into his penthouse office, with views that made Elizabeth's breath catch. A desk was already set up for her, equipped with the latest technology. Your first task, Robert said, placing a stack of documents before her, is to process these invoices. Don't worry about the details. Just enter the numbers exactly as I mark them. Elizabeth sat down, noting the strange formatting of the documents, the odd company names, the impossibly large sums. Everything about this felt wrong, but when she glanced at her phone and saw a text from the hospital about her mother, she pushed her concerns aside. That evening, as she drove to visit her mother, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a deal with the devil. But watching her mother's face light up when she shared the news about her new job, seeing hope replace pain in those beloved eyes, she told herself it didn't matter. She could handle whatever this job entailed. She could ignore the knot in her stomach when Robert asked her to make unusual bank transfers. She could pretend not to notice the late-night meetings with nervous-looking men carrying briefcases. For her mother, she could do anything. But as she left the hospital that night, Elizabeth couldn't help wondering what price she would ultimately pay for her desperate choice. The city lights twinkled around her like stars, beautiful and cold, offering no answers to her silent questions. The numbers weren't adding up, and Elizabeth knew it. Sitting at her desk late one evening, she stared at her computer screen until the figures blurred before her eyes. After 2 months at Miller Enterprises, she had developed a nagging sense that something was deeply wrong with the company's finances. The office was empty except for the steady hum of computers and the faint city noise filtering through the windows. Elizabeth had stayed late, claiming she needed to catch up on paperwork. In truth, she had been quietly investigating the strange patterns she'd noticed in the company's transactions. Tonight, everything clicked into place. The random numbers she'd been entering weren't random at all. Each invoice matched deposits to offshore accounts, the money moving through a maze of shell companies before vanishing. Her stomach turned as she realized what she'd been helping to do all along: launder money for what appeared to be a massive criminal operation. Her hand shook as she opened folder after folder on her computer. Every document bore her signature. Hundreds of transactions, millions of dollars, all processed with her unwitting help. The weight of her involvement crashed over her like a wave. A noise from Robert's office made her freeze. She quickly closed the files and pretended to work on routine tasks. Robert emerged, his tie loosened, looking surprised to see her. "Elizabeth? Still here?" His voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Just finishing up some reports," she replied, proud of how steady her voice remained. "I'll head out soon." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Don't stay too late, and remember to set the alarm when you leave." After he left, Elizabeth waited 15 minutes before moving. Her heart pounded as she slipped into Robert's office. She knew it was dangerous, but she had to find proof. Something to protect herself if everything fell apart. In her 2 months working there, she'd noticed Robert always kept a particular USB drive in his desk drawer. He never let anyone touch it, and he checked for it obsessively before leaving each day. Tonight, in his hurry, he'd forgotten it. The small black drive felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Elizabeth quickly copied its contents to her phone, then returned it exactly as she'd found it. Back at her desk, she began examining the files. What she found made her blood run cold. Bank statements, proof of bribes, records of threats against people who had discovered the truth. The operation was bigger than she'd imagined, involving corrupt politicians and dangerous criminals. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Her mother had responded well to her latest treatment. The doctors were optimistic. The treatments that were only possible because of her job with Robert. Elizabeth's vision blurred with tears as she realized her impossible situation. If she reported what she'd found, the company would be shut down. The money would stop. Her mother's treatments would end. But if she stayed, she was risking prison time, or worse, judging by some of the threats she'd discovered in Robert's files. Elizabeth's mind raced back to her interview with the FBI agent who'd processed her teaching license. Money laundering charges carry hefty sentences, he'd mentioned casually during their background check discussion. 20 years sometimes. More if you're deeply involved. She glanced at the photo of her mother on her desk, taken before the cancer. They were at the beach, both laughing as waves crashed behind them. Her mother had always taught her to do the right thing, no matter how hard it was. But what was the right thing when every choice led to disaster? The cleaning lady's cart rattled past, making Elizabeth jump. She quickly gathered her things, her mind churning with possibilities. She could go to the police, but Robert's files showed he had officers on his payroll. She could run, but her mother needed her. She could pretend she knew nothing, but every document she processed now felt like another nail in her coffin. The drive home was a blur. Elizabeth parked in her usual spot, now able to afford a small apartment instead of sleeping in her car. But tonight, the modest space felt like a prison. Everything she owned, everything she'd rebuilt, was paid for with tainted money. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, watching the sun rise over the city. Her phone contained enough evidence to bring down Miller Enterprises, but using it would destroy everything she'd fought so hard to save. The morning brought no clarity. Elizabeth dressed for work mechanically, her movements slow and heavy. She checked her phone. Another hospital update. Her mother was scheduled for an important procedure next week, a procedure that would never happen if the truth about Miller Enterprises came to light. As she drove to work, Elizabeth caught sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, and her face looked years older than it had just months ago. She barely recognized herself anymore. The security guard nodded as she entered the building. Elizabeth forced a smile, wondering if he was one of the many people on Robert's payroll. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual, each floor bringing her closer to a decision she wasn't ready to make. Robert was already in his office when she arrived. He looked up from his computer, smiling that same smooth smile that had once seemed so reassuring. Now she saw the predator behind it. "Good morning, Elizabeth. Could you process these transfers first thing?" He held out a stack of papers. She took them with steady hands, years of teaching having taught her how to hide her emotions. As she walked to her desk, Elizabeth realized she had until the end of the day to decide: her mother's life or her own freedom. The USB drive's contents burned in her phone like a live coal. Everything she needed to do the right thing was there, waiting for her to be brave enough to use it. But as she stared at the new stack of documents, each one a carefully disguised crime, Elizabeth wondered if she would ever be brave enough to make that choice. Detective Michael Hayes sat in his unmarked car, watching the entrance of Miller Enterprises through a light evening rain. 5 years of investigation, countless hours of surveillance, and still Robert Miller remained untouchable. The detective took another sip of cold coffee, his eyes fixed on the building's glass doors. Movement caught his attention. A young woman emerged, her shoulders hunched against the rain. Hayes recognized her immediately. Elizabeth Anderson, Miller's newest hire. Her employment file had raised several red flags. A former teacher with no business experience, hired without an interview, commanding a salary that made seasoned executives envious. Hayes watched as Elizabeth walked to her car, then simply sat behind the wheel. Even from a distance, he could see her shoulders shaking with sobs. It was a scene he'd witnessed too many times before. Miller's pattern of hiring desperate people, using their vulnerabilities to trap them in his web of crime. Making a decision, Hayes stepped out of his car. The rain had eased to a drizzle as he approached Elizabeth's vehicle, deliberately making his footsteps audible to avoid startling her. He knocked gently on her window. Elizabeth jumped, quickly wiping her eyes. Hayes held up his badge, speaking through the glass. "Miss Anderson, Detective Michael Hayes. May I have a word?" Fear flashed across her face, the kind of fear Hayes had seen in others caught in Miller's operation. She rolled down her window slightly, her voice barely steady. "Is something wrong, Detective?" "Not here," Hayes said quietly. "There are cameras. Would you follow me to the diner around the corner? I'll buy you a cup of coffee." Elizabeth hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. Hayes watched in his rearview mirror as she followed his car to Joe's Diner, a small place he'd used for countless confidential meetings over the years. They took a booth in the back, away from other customers. The waitress brought coffee without being asked, familiar with Hayes's routine. Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. "You're in trouble, Miss Anderson," Hayes began gently. "Though I suspect you already know that." "I don't know what you're talking about," Elizabeth replied, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Hayes pulled out a thin file and laid it on the table. 2 months ago, you were living in your car, working 3 jobs to pay for your mother's cancer treatments. Now you're making 6 figures as Robert Miller's assistant. That's quite a leap. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "You've been investigating me." "I've been investigating Miller for 5 years. You're his latest victim." Hayes leaned forward. "He looks for people in desperate situations. People who need money so badly they'll ignore their instincts. People who'll keep quiet out of fear or necessity." Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "My mother, she needs the treatments. I can't." "I know about your mother," Hayes said softly. "I also know you've discovered what Miller really does. You found the USB drive 2 nights ago." Elizabeth's face went pale. "How did you?" "Because I've been watching, waiting for the moment when you realized the truth. I'm offering you a way out, Elizabeth, but it will take incredible courage." The diner's fluorescent lights flickered as Elizabeth stared into her coffee. "He has people everywhere. Police, judges. Some," Hayes admitted, "but not as many as he wants you to believe. Not anymore. We've been building a case, but we need someone on the inside. Someone with access to current records." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "You want me to help you? To spy on him?" "I want to help you save yourself before it's too late. Miller's previous assistants haven't fared well. Some are in prison. Some disappeared. One had an accident right before she was supposed to testify." The color drained from Elizabeth's face. Hayes watched as the full reality of her situation sank in. She pulled out her phone, showing him a photo of her mother in the hospital. "I can't let her die, Detective. The treatments are working." Hayes nodded sympathetically. If you help us, we can protect both of you. The FBI has a witness protection program. They can ensure your mother continues receiving care. Somewhere Miller can't find either of you. And if I refuse, then I'll respect your decision. But sooner or later, Miller will fall. When that happens, everyone involved goes down with him, including you." Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, watching rain streak down the diner's windows. How would it work if I helped? Hayes explained the plan carefully. How she would wear a hidden recording device. How she would need to collect specific documents. How federal agents would be watching, ready to move if she was ever in danger. It would take about 2 weeks to gather everything we need. He finished. 2 weeks of absolute normalcy. Miller can't suspect anything. 2 weeks of pretending, Elizabeth murmured. 2 weeks of looking him in the eye, knowing what I'm doing. It's your choice, Hayes said. But you don't have much time. Miller's getting nervous. He's been moving money faster than usual. Something big is coming. Elizabeth pulled out her own file, paper sheets secretly copied over the past few days. Like this? She asked, sliding them across the table. Hayes examined the documents, his expression grim. Yes, exactly like this. He's preparing to shut down operations, move everything offshore. When that happens, will all be loose ends? Elizabeth finished quietly. The waitress refilled their coffee cups, the mundane action strange against the weight of their conversation. Elizabeth stared at her reflection in the dark liquid, seeing the choice before her written in her own tired eyes. If I do this, she said finally, you swear you'll protect my mother, no matter what happens to me. You have my word, Hayes replied. Both of you will be safe. Elizabeth took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. In that moment, Hayes saw not a victim, but a survivor, someone finding strength she didn't know she had. Then I'll help you, she said. Tell me what you need me to do. Hayes reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device no bigger than a button. We start tomorrow. Wear this. Act normal. Remember, 2 weeks of courage is all we need. As they left the diner, the rain had stopped. Elizabeth walked to her car with new purpose in her step. Hayes watched her drive away, hoping he could keep his promise to protect her. In his years of detective work, he'd learned that courage often came from the most unexpected places. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. For now, both detective and reluctant spy carried their own weights of responsibility into the night, knowing that the next 2 weeks would change everything. The tiny recording device felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds against Elizabeth's skin as she walked into Miller Enterprises that morning. Detective Hayes had shown her how to attach it discreetly under her blouse, assuring her it was undetectable. Still, she was certain Robert would notice, that her guilty conscience was visible on her face. Morning, Elizabeth, Robert called as she passed his office. Come in for a moment. Her heart pounded as she entered. Would today be the day he discovered her betrayal? But Robert merely smiled, pushing a stack of papers across his desk. These need special attention, he said. Process them yourself. No delegating. And Elizabeth. His eyes locked onto hers. Double-check your work. We can't afford mistakes. She recognized the warning in his tone. Taking the papers, she returned to her desk, hands trembling slightly as she began entering the transactions. Each keystroke felt like another link in the chain of evidence she was building against him. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Her mother's latest test results weren't good. The cancer was spreading despite the treatments. Elizabeth closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She couldn't break down. Not here. Not now. Everything all right? Robert's voice made her jump. He stood behind her chair. Too close. Yes, she managed. Just tired. Your mother's treatments must be exhausting, he said softly. Such expensive care. It would be terrible if anything interrupted them. Elizabeth felt cold despite the warm office. The threat was clear. Stay in line, or your mother suffers. She forced herself to nod, to keep typing, to act normal while the wire recorded every word. Days passed like this, each one a test of her nerve. Elizabeth gathered evidence methodically, copying files when she could, recording conversations that grew increasingly incriminating. But Robert's scrutiny intensified. He began calling her into late-night meetings, testing her loyalty with increasingly illegal tasks. One evening, a week into her undercover work, Robert handed her a sealed envelope. "Deliver this personally to Mr. Jackson at the address listed. No questions asked." Elizabeth knew Mr. Jackson. He appeared in several suspicious transactions she'd recorded. The envelope felt heavy, likely containing cash. She thought of Detective Hayes's instructions: maintain cover, gather evidence, stay alive. The delivery location was a dimly lit parking garage. Mr. Jackson emerged from the shadows, his face hard. As she handed over the envelope, she noticed the gun barely concealed under his jacket. The wire recorded everything. Back in her car, Elizabeth finally let herself shake. She was in deeper than she'd ever imagined. But just as she was about to call Hayes and end it all, her phone rang. The hospital again. Her mother had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors needed approval for an emergency procedure, one that wasn't covered by insurance. The cost was astronomical. When she walked into work the next morning, Robert was waiting. "I heard about your mother," he said, his voice full of false concern. "Such a shame, but I might be able to help, if you're willing to take on some additional responsibilities." Elizabeth felt sick as he outlined what he wanted, her signature on documents that would implicate her completely in his crimes. The money he offered would cover her mother's procedure and more. "Think about it," he said. "Family comes first, after all." She thought about Detective Hayes, about the evidence they'd collected about justice. Then she thought about her mother, fighting for life in a hospital bed. The choice tore at her soul. That night, she met Hayes in their usual diner. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she confessed, showing him the hospital bills. Hayes listened gravely. "We're close, Elizabeth. The evidence you've gathered, it's more than we've ever had. Just a few more days." "He knows about my mother's condition," she said. "He's using it against me." "That's his pattern," Hayes replied. "He finds people's breaking points. Don't let him break you." Elizabeth stared out the window at the city lights. What if he already has? The next morning, she signed the documents Robert had prepared. The wire recorded the scratch of her pen, her quiet agreement to his terms, the rustle of papers that could send her to prison. But it also recorded Robert's revealing statements about his operation, his network, his crimes. Each day became a balancing act between gathering evidence and protecting her mother. Elizabeth lived in constant fear of discovery, jumping at every unexpected sound, analyzing every look from Robert. The wire felt heavier each morning as she pinned it on, a constant reminder of her double life. Her mother's condition continued to decline. Elizabeth spent her evenings at the hospital, holding her mother's hand, fighting guilt over the source of the money paying for her care. During the day, she watched Robert's criminal empire operate, collecting proof of its corruption while participating in its schemes. "Just 2 more days," Hayes promised during their latest meeting. "We're almost ready to move." But that night, Robert called her into his office late. On his computer screen was a photo that made her blood freeze, herself and Detective Hayes at the diner. "Care to explain this?" Robert asked quietly. Elizabeth's mind raced. The wire was recording. Whatever happened next would be evidence, if she survived to deliver it. She thought of her mother, of Hayes, of the choice she'd made when she agreed to help. Her hand moved toward the button that would signal Hayes for emergency extraction. Robert's eyes followed the movement. The next few seconds would determine everything: her life, her mother's future, the success of the investigation. In that moment, Elizabeth Anderson, former third-grade teacher, had to decide what kind of person she truly was. The wire recorded her racing heartbeat as she made her choice. The conference room on the top floor of Miller Enterprises hummed with tension. Elizabeth sat quietly taking notes as Robert addressed the dozen men gathered around the polished table. Each face represented a different part of his criminal empire. Bankers, politicians, business owners. The wire beneath her blouse captured every word. "Our Asian operations are secure," Robert was saying. "The new accounts are untraceable. Elizabeth, show them the projections." She stood, willing her hands not to shake as she distributed the documents. These weren't just financial reports. They were proof of international money laundering on a massive scale. Detective Hayes had told her this meeting could be the key to everything. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Hospital. Elizabeth's heart stuttered, but she couldn't check it. Not now. She continued passing out papers, trying to focus on Robert's voice. "As you can see, gentlemen, our quarterly returns have exceeded expectations." Another vibration, then another. Elizabeth felt sick. Something was wrong. The hospital never called repeatedly unless it was an emergency. Her mother had been stable that morning, sleeping peacefully when Elizabeth kissed her goodbye. "Elizabeth." Robert's sharp tone snapped her attention back. "The Singapore numbers." She recited the figures automatically, her mind spinning. The phone buzzed again. She needed to check it. She needed to stay. Her mother needed her. The investigation needed her. "Excuse me," she whispered, slipping out of the conference room. In the hallway, she pulled out her phone. 4 missed calls from the hospital. 1 text message. "Emergency. Your mother has coded. Come immediately." The world tilted sideways. Elizabeth leaned against the wall, trying to breathe. Coded. Her mother's heart had stopped. She was dying, maybe already dead, while Elizabeth stood in this building helping take down criminals. Robert's voice drifted through the door. "Now, about our plans to liquidate assets." This was it. The conversation Hayes had been waiting for. Proof of their entire operation. Elizabeth's wire was recording everything. If she left now, they might lose their only chance. Her phone buzzed again. The hospital. Tears blurred her vision as she silently begged for forgiveness. Then she straightened her blouse, wiped her eyes, and walked back into the conference room. "Sorry for the interruption," she said smoothly, resuming her seat. Inside, she was screaming. The meeting continued. Elizabeth took notes mechanically, her pen moving across the paper while her heart shattered. Robert detailed their plans to close operations, move money offshore, eliminate loose ends. The wire caught every damning word. 1 hour passed. 2. Elizabeth imagined her mother alone in the hospital, machines beeping an alarm, doctors rushing to save her. She imagined holding her mother's hand one last time, saying goodbye, telling her how much she loved her. Instead, she sat in this sterile conference room, watching criminals plan their escapes, choosing duty over love in the most excruciating moment of her life. "Elizabeth, get Mr. Chen the files from my office," Robert ordered. She stood, walking to his office on legs that felt like lead. Alone for a moment, she checked her phone again. 5 more missed calls. No messages. What did that mean? Was her mother gone? Was she hanging on? The not knowing was torture. Gathering the files, Elizabeth caught her reflection in Robert's window. She barely recognized herself, this woman who could sit calmly while her mother died, all for the sake of justice. What kind of daughter was she? Back in the conference room, the meeting was reaching its climax. Robert was laying out the timeline for closing everything down. This was what Hayes needed. Dates, names, locations. Elizabeth's wire captured it all while her heart broke into pieces. "We move everything next week," Robert announced. "No loose ends, no traces. Elizabeth will coordinate the transfers." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Her phone had stopped buzzing. The silence felt worse than the constant alerts. She imagined doctors giving up, calling time of death, covering her mother's face with a sheet while her only daughter sat in this room full of criminals. Finally, after what felt like years, the meeting ended. The men filed out, leaving Elizabeth alone with Robert. "Good work today," he said, gathering his papers. You've proven your loyalty. Loyalty. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She had betrayed her mother's most fundamental lesson, that love matters more than anything. That family comes first. The moment Robert left, Elizabeth ran for her car. The hospital was 20 minutes away in good traffic. She made it in 12, running red lights, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The ICU was quiet when she arrived. A nurse she recognized looked up, her face grave. "Elizabeth, please," Elizabeth whispered. "Please tell me she's still." The nurse took her hand. "She's alive. The doctors got her back." But what? "She's asking for you. She doesn't have much time left." Elizabeth followed the nurse to her mother's room, her legs barely supporting her. The wire was still recording. She should remove it, call Hayes, end this. But she couldn't think about that now. Her mother lay small and pale against the white sheets, tubes and wires everywhere. Her eyes fluttered open as Elizabeth approached. "Baby," she whispered, "where were you?" Elizabeth took her mother's hand, cold and fragile as a bird's wing. "I'm here now, Mom. I'm here. I'm so sorry." "Don't cry," her mother said softly. "You must have had a good reason." Elizabeth broke down then, sobbing as she held her mother's hand. She had chosen justice over love, duty over family. The evidence she'd gathered would save lives, stop crimes, protect others. But it had cost her the most precious moment she could never get back. The wire recorded it all. Her tears, her mother's labored breathing, the steady beep of monitors marking out the remaining minutes they had together. Somewhere in the city, Hayes and his team were probably listening, bearing witness to the price of justice. Elizabeth stayed until dawn, holding her mother's hand, memorizing her face, trying to fit a lifetime of love into these final hours. The wire recorded that too, a daughter's vigil, a mother's goodbye, the sacrifice that justice sometimes demands. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Maria Anderson Memorial Foundation as Elizabeth straightened the photo of her mother on her desk. 5 years had passed since that night when duty and love had collided, leaving her forever changed. The foundation's modern offices occupied the entire floor of what was once Miller Enterprises building, a transformation that felt both fitting and healing. Police sirens had filled these streets the morning after her mother's passing. Elizabeth had watched from her hospital chair as breaking news announced the arrests. Robert Miller and his entire network were taken down in coordinated raids across the city. The evidence she'd gathered, including that final devastating meeting, had provided everything the authorities needed. Detective Hayes had found her at the hospital, his face showing both triumph and deep sadness. "You did it, Elizabeth. They're all in custody. I'm so sorry about your mother." Maria had slipped away peacefully just before sunrise, holding her daughter's hand. Her last words had been, "Make it matter, baby. Whatever you did, make it matter." Those words became Elizabeth's mission. When the case concluded, the courts had seized over $300 million in illegal assets. Elizabeth stood before the judge during the sentencing, her voice steady as she proposed using the recovered funds to establish a foundation for cancer patients who couldn't afford treatment. "My mother died because we couldn't afford proper care soon enough," she told the court. "The money that bought my silence should now give others a voice." The judge agreed. Robert, facing life in prison, watched from the defendant's table as his criminal empire was transformed into something beautiful. Now, 5 years later, Elizabeth walked through the foundation's halls, greeting the staff who had become like family. Photos of smiling patients lined the walls. Hundreds of lives saved. Thousands of families spared the impossible choices she had faced. "Ms. Anderson," her assistant poked her head in. "The new family is here." Elizabeth nodded, gathering her composure. Each new case still touched her heart. She walked to the conference room, where a young mother sat with her teenage daughter. Their faces showed the same fear and desperation she remembered so well. "I'm Elizabeth Anderson," she said warmly, sitting across from them. "Tell me about your situation." The mother's story was painfully familiar. Cancer diagnosis, no insurance, mounting bills. The daughter held her mother's hand just as Elizabeth once had. "We can't afford the treatments," the mother finished, tears in her eyes. "They say without them." "Stop right there," Elizabeth said gently. "That's why we're here. The foundation will cover everything. Treatments, medications, support services, all of it." The relief on their faces made Elizabeth's heart swell. This was why she had made her choice that night. This was how she made it matter. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth visited the Foundation's research wing, where brilliant minds worked to find more affordable cancer treatments. The labs hummed with purpose, each scientist driven by the stories of the families they helped. Detective Hayes, now retired, served on the Foundation's board. He stopped by occasionally, always pausing at Maria's photo in the lobby. "She would be proud," he said during one visit. "You turned darkness into light." Elizabeth had learned to live with her choice. The wire recording from that final night was sealed in evidence, but she kept a copy. Sometimes, on difficult days, she listened to it, not to the criminal confessions, but to the last hours with her mother. It reminded her why the Foundation's work mattered so much.